So I'm Julie Greenberg, as you all know, and I organized this Slack orientation because we've been hit with all of the virtual field work that we've all been doing this past year, with a lot of new apps and technology and everything. And Slack is one of the pieces that is, I think, has been very useful to date in keeping people communicating when they can't communicate in person, and it's going to continue to be that way. Now, doing it now, when it really has general applicability to, I think, a lot of activities going forward, seemed like a good idea because of the formation of this voter protection professionals, VoPro Pros group that emerged from all of the absentee ballot curing processes in both Georgia and in North Carolina and then Georgia. And so it seemed as if, for those of you that are really interested in maybe only at a slow burn, but sort of not completely, putting aside political activism at this point, but just sort of keeping a little, your toe in the water. The VoPro Pros seems like something that some of you might want to monitor on Slack, as well as becoming part of the community that is linked to a website that's going to be launched officially in March. Now, I happen to know that they're starting to get organized on the website because I put my name in on the website, this VoPro Pros website, to that I was saying I was interested in hearing more, keep getting updates. And indeed, yesterday I got an update. I got a Google form that said, what sort of experience do you have in your professional life? What sort of volunteer experience are you interested? What skills can you bring to volunteer work? How many hours a week or a month are you interested in doing this? So they are starting to reach out to people. So this is something that, you don't need to get involved in now, but it does seem like it's a good time to start. So when I thought about that, I thought, well, I'm going to turn to a person who did such a great job orienting a bunch of volunteers to the North Carolina Voter Assistance Hotline, which, as you may recall, did not really, for those of you that did this, did not really have an onboarding process. It was a do-it-yourself sort of process, and getting familiar with all of the websites you had to have open and the database you had to use was something that took a little bit of support. And so I turned to Lisa Friedman because she had been doing work on that voter assistance hotline, and actually Cindy Anderson, I think, was actually the one who turned to her first. Anyway, it was a group effort with Barbara Woodall, and we turned to Lisa and we said, Lisa, could you put together an orientation? She did. It was really, really helpful. We had a large group of people. I think all of us found it, even those of us that had done some work on the voter assistance hotline, found it helpful. And so I turned to Lisa again and said, Lisa, because one of the things she had covered in that orientation was Slack, I said, Lisa, would you be willing to sort of broaden out on the Slack orientation part and do a full sort of introduction to that? So that's what we're going to do for this first half hour. And there'll be a recording of this. And I will then, after this session, send to you the Slack invitation as well as the website address if you don't have it already for this VoPro Pros. And then you can dabble in it as you wish. And then the second half hour is more, back and forth and question and answer. During this first half hour, we're going to take a couple breaks for questions, but why don't you put questions in the chat? And then when we come to a break time, we'll sort of sort those through and see which are relevant to talk about. Lisa, doesn't purport, and she'll tell you, we're not Slack experts, so I'm not a Slack expert, she's not one. There may be questions you have that go beyond our understanding, but we're going to try to give everybody the basics. So let's get started. Lisa, why don't you sort of say a few words about yourself, and then we'll go into the Slack orientation.
As Julie indicated, I'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into the main presentation. I learned to use Slack when I worked on the North Carolina voter assistance hotline. And the situation there, which fortunately you guys won't have to deal with, is that you had to get up to speed on 3 pieces of software and North Carolina voting laws, regulations, and practices literally within a few days to be a hotline volunteer. And from the moment you signed up for a shift, you were taking calls. I mean, we would sign up for a shift at at noon, from noon to 3, and at 12:05 you'd get your first call, and you needed to be ready to work with all that software and work with all the legal requirements, and it was really challenging. But as a result of that, I did learn to use Slack, and I'm really glad that I did, because I can see that it's a very useful program, not just in that context, but in a lot of other contexts like VoPro Pros. So if we're ready to get started, I'm going to bring up the materials that I'll be using. I'm going to be using a combination of slides and web pages, and Julie will send all of you a copy of the slides. For the web pages, I'm going to be zooming in on the web pages at about 125%. And I hope that's big enough that you can see the detail, but if it isn't, please let me know and I'll try and make them bigger. And then when I'm showing slides and web pages, I'll be shutting off my video so that all the screen real estate will be devoted to slides and web pages so that you can see things up close and personal. Okay, and with that, let's get started. Okay, so as we've been talking about a little bit, we're going to learn about using Slack. And Slack is a web-based software program that facilitates written communication among, let me just get rid of my video. It facilitates written communication among groups of people who are working together. And for purposes of our discussion today, we're just going to call those people a team. Slack is basically an online message board, or you might call it a chat room, or you might even think of it as a community email inbox. And if you want to send written information to team members, instead of sending messages to each team member's email account using your email account, you'll send your message using Slack, and your message will be posted immediately on a message board that everyone on the team has access to. Team members can reply to your message, and these replies will also be posted immediately on the message board. Messages and replies are archived, and Slack has a search engine. So if you're looking for information in a message that's several months old, it's really pretty easy to find. Slack seems like kind of a weird name for this type of software, and it generally has negative connotations. I mean, we refer to people who aren't pulling their weight as slackers. But it's actually an acronym for searchable log of all conversation and knowledge. Does everybody see that at the bottom of the slide? And that's exactly what Slack does. So I think that's a good thing to remember. Slack is used by VoPro Pros for communications among team members about voter protection activities. But as Julie indicated and I indicated, many other organizations use Slack for other types of team communications. So knowing how to use Slack isn't just a skill that's helpful for working with VoPro Pros. It's also a good computer skill to have under your belt in case you work with other organizations that use Slack for internal communications. As I indicated a few minutes ago, the first time I used Slack was last fall when I signed up to work on a voter assistance hotline run by NC Dems. And working on the hotline, as I mentioned, required that you not only learn North Carolina voting laws and practices, which were complicated and constantly changing, but that you also learn to use 3 software programs, and one of those programs was Slack. And for that particular project, and I think you may get some comments from other people who worked on the hotline, I thought Slack was absolutely indispensable for handling communications among hotline volunteers and the North Carolina voting experts who were running the hotline. There were, to the best of my recollection, about 900 hotline volunteers from all over the country, and every person who worked on the hotline needed to be giving accurate and consistent advice to the tens of thousands of North Carolina voters who called the hotline. And in some cases, this was pretty easy because callers were asking easy questions that you could even answer off the top of your head. And in other cases, answering the questions was a little harder because you needed to look up or research the answers. However, in many cases, you could find an answer that you were pretty confident was correct. But there were also quite a few stump the stars questions that you couldn't find answers to, and you needed to consult with an expert on North Carolina election requirements or get input from your fellow hotline volunteers. And you needed to do this in real time because you had a voter on the phone who needed an answer. In addition, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, North Carolina voter requirements and practices were constantly changing, and you needed a way to keep up with all these changes. And then finally, some voters called to report on-site voting problems, such as harassment and voting delays at polling places, and you needed to immediately elevate those issues to hotline managers so they could be addressed in real time. And all of these communications took place within Slack. In retrospect, I really can't imagine how the hotline could have functioned effectively unless it used Slack or some program like Slack that enabled hotline managers and volunteers to quickly communicate among themselves in order to get accurate answers to voting questions and report voting problems. I worked on Slack on the voter assistance hotline for about 2 months. And in the nature of full disclosure, and I think Julie's already made this full disclosure, I'm sharing with you my experiences based on that 2-month stint, and I'm not really a Slack expert. There are many parts of Slack that I never had to use as a hotline volunteer, so I really don't know how they work. And you may not have to work with them either. So how do we get access to Slack? An organization that wants to use Slack sets up an account with Slack that enables them to create a Slack workspace. And that's the lingo that Slack uses for their team. So VoPro Pros has its own Slack workspace. You can get access to the VoPro Pros Slack workspace by contacting VoPro Pros and telling them you'd like to use their Slack workspace. But Julie has made that easy because if you give your name to Julie, she's going to forward it to VoPro Pros and get you in the loop. And then very shortly after Julie forwards VoPro Pros your name, you're going to receive an email message that looks like this, inviting you to join the VoPro Pros Slack workspace. And what you're going to do is you're going to click on the purple Join Now button in the message, and that's going to take you to a web page where you'll set up a username and password, something that we've done a gazillion times in our computer lives. The one thing you need to recognize is that the username you select will become your Slack display name. So you generally don't want to be using the name of your dog or cat or some other name that you really don't want to be known by publicly. This is not like setting up a username and password at some other sites. After you set up your login credentials, then you're going to get a second email message that contains a purple Open Slack button. And when you click the Open Slack button on a computer, your web browser will open to the VoPro Pros Slack workspace, which looks like this. And I remember the first time I opened the Slack software, I took one look at the user interface and I almost closed my web browser. I was so discouraged. This electronic workspace was about 10 times messier than my physical home workspace. But as I looked more closely at the software, I realized that it actually had an understandable organizational structure, and I just had to figure out how to use it. So that's mainly what we're going to be doing today, learning how to use the main components of Slack. We're going to see how they're organized, and we're going to learn how to work with them. I'm going to be working with the web-based version of the Slack software today, but you should be aware that Slack software is also available in a desktop version that you can download and install on your computer, and in a mobile app version that you can download and install on your phone or tablet. And the last page of the slides, which you're going to be given a copy of, see down here at the bottom, there are some links that you can go to where you can either actually download the software for desktop or that will have information on the mobile apps. So if you're interested in using those other versions of Slack, it should be very easy for you to get a hold of them. So this is Slack the way it looks on your computer screen. And if we look at Slack in a slide, the first thing to notice is that it's divided into 3 sections. There's a left-hand section, a center section, and a right-hand section. And the left and center sections are always displayed, and the right section is displayed only under certain circumstances, which we'll talk about a little bit later. One of the things that makes the Slack channel, the Slack workspace very cluttered is not simply the user interface, the 3 different sections and all the stuff that's going on in each section, but the fact that some team members use lots of graphics in their messages. They put in photos, emojis, animated GIFs, etc. And I'm just going to show you some of those as we'll scroll through some messages here. You can see this one is flashing, and we've got this stuff here and hearts and pictures and all kinds of other stuff. I personally find these very distracting. If you do too, you just need to train your eyes to ignore them because there's no way you can get rid of them. And of course, you wouldn't use them in your own messages. So looking at the Slack user interface, the first thing we're going to start with is the left-hand section. This section over here. And again, if we look at Slack, it's this big purple bar that's on the left. There are 2 main things that you need to pay attention to in this section. And the first one is at the top. At the very top of the bar, you'll see the name of the workspace that you're working in. And if you've only signed up for one Slack workspace, like VoPro Pros, this is the only name that will appear in this space. But if you work with more than one Slack workspace, you'll see multiple names listed, and you need to select the workspace that you want to work with. The second thing that you need to pay attention to in this on the left side, this purple bar, is the list of channels for your Slack workspace. If you think about email programs, and I'm going to demo this with Gmail. Most email programs have a panel on the left where you set up folders that you use to organize your message. So here are my messages here on the right, and then on the left, I have a panel of folders. In a similar fashion, channels are the way for the leader of a Slack team to organize messages in Slack. Some workspaces will have only one channel, some will have multiple channels. It really depends on what the team is doing. Each channel connects to a separate message board. So here, for example, we have 6 channels, and that means 6 different message boards, one for each of 5 projects plus a general message board. And the way you access the message board is to click the appropriate channel in the left section. So going back to the VoPro Pros workspace, If I want to see the messages that have been sent in to the general channel, the general message board, I would click on general. If I want to see the messages that have been sent into the onboarding message board, I will click on onboarding. And hopefully everybody sees these are different messages. And channels are what keep them organized. All your general channels are together. You click on general to see the general messages, and then you click on onboarding to see the messages that people have sent to the onboarding channel. We'll talk about how you send messages in Slack in a few minutes, but for right now, it's important for you to understand that channels are how messages are organized in Slack. So whether you're reading messages or you're sending messages, it's very important that you be in the correct channel. And the way you select a channel is to click in the left section. Hopefully this isn't true of anyone on this call, but some people are kind of sloppy about how they organize their computer files or their email messages. And generally that only affects them. So if you misplaced a document in your filing system, you're the one that has to spend 10 or 15 minutes searching for it. But when you're working on a Slack team, your failure to keep information in the proper channel affects everyone on the team. If you put messages in the wrong channel, your teammates will have great difficulty finding them. So you really need to make a concerted effort to keep your messages in Slack organized so that everyone on the team can easily access them. Does everyone understand the concept of channels, why channels are important in Slack, and how you select the channel you want to work with? Okay, great.
If I can, this is Julie, I just want to interject that at this point, I think there are about 25 different channels that have been set up in VoPro Pros.
And I'm actually going to show those to people in a minute.
Yeah.
You'll see over here in the purple section that we have two channels, general, which I think is just general information about voter protection activities. And then onboarding appears to be messages from team members explaining what their background is in election activities. But in fact, VoPro Pro has a total of 20 channels. And well, gee, you can't see them. Well, what if you wanted to look at the messages for some of those other channels? How would you do that? And the way you do that is you're going to click on this little plus, add channels. A little menu comes up and it says browse all channels. And up come a list of all the other channels that have been set up in VoPro Pros. And you can just scroll down and you can see what they're about. And let's say you're interested in finding out what kind of messages have been sent in to this particular channel. It's called Voting Laws and Processes. It has 27 members. That means 27 people have signed up for this particular channel. And if you want to join that channel, you just click this green join button. And can everybody see how that adds the channel to your list of channels? And then if I want to look at the messages that have been sent into that channel, I just click it and the messages show up in the center section. Let's say I sign up for this and I start reading the messages and I find out, gee, they're really not very interesting. So I don't want to look at this channel anymore. Again, I click on add channels. I click on browse all channels. And then I'm going to go down here to voting laws and processes. And I mouse over here. Shows that I've joined that. Whoops, I'm sorry. Let me go back and do that again. There we go. When I mouse over here, on the left, instead of seeing a join button, I see a leave button. And I just click that, and that takes the channel off of my list.
So Lisa, Corey is wondering, what if you have a message that maybe it belongs in, for some reason, let's say, just say general and onboarding. Can a message go in two channels simultaneously?
I must admit, I don't know. When I worked on the North Carolina voter hotline, they only had one channel, basically, that everyone was using. So I don't know. I assume when you send messages, and we'll talk about sending messages in a minute, that it is possible to send a message to more than one channel.
Yeah, I would assume. And if
but
I
after the fact, if you have sent it to one channel and you now decide you want it in another channel, I guess maybe you just resend the message to the other channel.
Yeah, and onboarding is just, that's a place where new members who just joined the VoPro Pros Slack can sort of introduce themselves.
Yeah, and
yeah.
I don't know whether people can read some of the messages that have been sent it there, but they start out, "Hi, I'm from such and such, and this is the kind of work that I've been doing, election work that I've been doing." So if you really want to get involved with VoPro Pros, you might want to send in a message about yourself to the onboarding channel. Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about is the center section. In the center section, and we've sort of already seen this, that's where you're actually going to see the messages that team members have sent into the message board for a particular channel. So again, if I click the general channel, I'm going to see the messages that people have sent into the general channel. And if I click onboarding, then I'm going to see the message board for the onboarding channel. In some respects, Slack message boards look and work like an email inbox, but in some other respects, they're different. And because we're all familiar with working with email, understanding some of these similarities and differences will help you work more efficiently with Slack message boards. So I'm here in the general channel, and like your email inbox, Slack messages are organized in a list by date. But the list is organized in ascending date order with the newest messages at the bottom. And if you recall your email program, most email programs put the newest messages at the top. So when you're looking at the message board in Slack, if you're looking for new messages, your eyes need to go to the bottom of the list, not the top of the list, because that's the way Slack organizes messages. Like email messages, you can easily figure out who sent a Slack message and when it was sent, because that information is prominently displayed for each message on the left. Everybody can see this. This is a message that came in from Claire Sorolia and came in at 3:48 p.m. On Monday. However, unlike Slack messages, you won't be seeing any subject lines on a Slack message board message. Slack just doesn't use them. And if you compare that again with your email program, your list of email messages is a list of subject matter lines. That is not true in Slack. What you see in Slack is the entire message, and there is no subject matter line. So when you're scrolling through messages, that has some pluses and minuses. The entire message is there. It's easy for you to view. But on the other hand, there isn't a brief summary of what the message is about. So you're going to have to scan the entire message to figure out what the message is about. Like most email programs, there's a scroll bar on the right-hand side of the list that allows you to scroll through the messages. And I'm just going to take this one and move it up and down. As you scroll up and down, you'll see date markers appear so that you can quickly figure out whether you're looking at messages from last Tuesday or last week or whenever. Hopefully you can see these change. Here's Monday, here's Sunday. As I move the scroll bar up and down, it takes me through the messages chronologically. One of the things that email programs do a pretty good job of is distinguishing between messages that you've opened and messages that you haven't opened. And email programs refer to these messages as read messages and unread messages, respectively, even though your email program really can't tell whether you've actually read a message or not. And if you think back on your email program, the way email programs generally distinguish unread and read messages is by bolding the headers of unread messages in a message list and listing the read messages in regular text. So the messages that I haven't read, this one from the DC Public Library and King Arthur Baking, et cetera, those are all unread messages. I haven't opened them. But if you look in Slack, it doesn't really have a good system for distinguishing between read and unread messages because you don't open messages in Slack the way you do in an email program. Slack, in fact, assumes that you've read a message if you merely scroll through it. So simply by scrolling through these messages like that, Slack assumes I've read all those messages. So one of the things that's tricky in Slack in terms of keeping track of messages is trying to figure out which ones you've read and which ones you haven't read. And the easiest way to do that, if you're trying to figure out which of these many messages you've actually read and you haven't read, is to start each of your Slack sessions by clicking the More button over here in the in the purple bar. And then you're going to click on All Unreads. And in this case, because I've scrolled through all the messages, Slack thinks I've read all of them. But if you haven't scrolled through certain messages, Slack will list them here as unread messages. And then those are the messages that you need to focus on. To give you an idea of how team members work with the message board, I'll give you an example from my work on the North Carolina Voter Assistance Hotline. Volunteers worked on the hotline in 3-hour shifts. And so about 15 or 20 minutes before I started each of my shifts, I'd open Slack. I'd skim through the messages that had been posted since my last shift. And that was easy because I could just look at the time in the message list. For example, if my last shift ended at 6 o'clock on Tuesday and it was now 9 o'clock on Thursday, I just look at the messages that had been posted between those two times. So it was pretty easy to figure out which messages I hadn't read. And looking at the messages helped me understand what types of voter questions the hotline was getting, because the voter questions varied significantly throughout the election cycle. And I was also able to see answers to some of the tougher questions callers had asked in case those questions came up on my shift. And then if I had slow periods during my shift, I'd continue to scan the message board for new messages. And in some cases, I was actually able to provide answers to questions that my fellow volunteers were raising. But even if I couldn't answer the questions, the messages would continue to help educate me about the types of calls the hotline was getting and what the answers were to some of the more difficult questions that callers were raising. Are there questions about messages? Do people understand this concept of a message board and how it's structured and how it works?
Lisa.
Uh-huh.
Hi, this is Shirley.
Hi, Shirley.
Hello. I've had this Slack thing like on I had an app, but I never understood how to use it. And it was always, sort of happenstance what I happened to read. So I know that you said that VoPro Pro had 20 channels.
Uh-huh.
So who sets them up? Like, for example, let's say that you're in the general thing and then a topic starts to take off. And so you're looking for additional input on that. And you think that that there ought to be a dedicated channel devoted to that. Like, for example, the channel that you deleted, which was Voter Process with a picture of Mark Elias. How do you do that?
I honestly don't know, because when I worked on the North Carolina Voter Assistance Hotline, I never felt a need to add any channels,
Right.
nor
Okay.
did I personally add them. I assume the team leader for the workspace can add channels. I
Right.
don't know whether individual team members can add channels. Julie, do you happen to know?
That's a good question. I assume that is something that the
Team leader.
leadership, the team leaders are doing, and it's not sort of open to everybody, but honestly, I don't know.
Okay.
So one of the things you could do, Shirley, is if you're working in a Slack workspace and you think there's a need to add a new channel because a new topic has come up, you could contact the
Okay. That
Yeah,
makes
you
sense.
could, yeah, the team leader for the workspace, and ask him or her to open up a new channel.
Yep.
So Lisa, this is Jan. What's the column on the right that says thread, and how
Oh, we're
does
going to
that?
talk about that in a little bit.
Oh, okay.
We're sort of moving through our channels. We're starting on the left, and then we're moving in the center, and I'll be talking about some of the other spaces as well. And
Okay.
we're,
Lisa, this is Julie. I wonder if you could just create a message right now and show us how the other team members, basically their name, can be shown.
I'm actually gonna cover that in a few minutes.
Oh, good. Okay.
Okay.
Excuse me. This is Nick.
Hi, Nick.
What does onboarding mean?
As far as I can figure out, this is a channel that allows team members to introduce themselves to the rest of the team. And if we sort of scroll through the messages here, if you want to, I don't suggest that you spend a lot of your time reading this. But for example, here's one from Deborah Wells. Hi, everyone. I'm living in State College, Pennsylvania, yada, yada, yada. Nice to see you all. I'm here by way of Pennsylvania and Georgia's VoPro efforts on the poll watcher assignment teams. So she's telling you this is my personal background in election work.
Okay.
And that's what a lot of the people are doing. They're just introducing themselves. This is the kind of election work that I've done, et cetera.
Yeah.
And there are 581 team members for onboarding. And I don't know how many messages there are. There are probably a lot. And it might be kind of fun to read through some of these, but you basically, I think what you're going to be reading are introductions from people. You're going to be reading little short CVs for everybody. Okay.
Hi, this is Catherine. So I had a question too. I know when I was had Slack, when I was doing some phone banking or something, I think, I kept getting messages from Slackbot, and so what is that about?
I honestly don't know what Slackbot is. Julie, do you have any idea? The fact that it's a bot suggests that they're messages that are sent to large numbers of people.
Yeah, I have looked at some of Slack bot messages that come periodically, and I've never understood. They've never been of any use to me, and I've never understood their purpose. So, yeah,
Okay.
I disregard them now.
Catherine, one of the things that we're going to talk about at the very end of our session is that there's a great help page at the Slack website that can tell you about all this stuff. There are just tons of things that we aren't going to have time to go over in this class. There are tons of things that in Slack that you will probably never use or you will never find useful. But if you want to learn about them, they have a great sort of tech support page where you can find out about Slackbot and a gazillion other things that are in Slack, because it's a very sophisticated program.
Can I tell you what a Slackbot is? It's
Sure.
an automated message sender. It sends a message that is triggered by key phrases. So if you accidentally type in polling hours, there's probably an automatic message that will give you information about polling hours.
Oh.
And oftentimes I've been in Slackbot where they warn you not to use certain words because it will trigger the Slackbot and your whole page will fill up with Slackbot messages.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thanks
That's
for
very
warning us.
helpful.
Yeah, that was very helpful. That was extremely helpful.
Mm.
Well, now that we've seen the message board, let's talk a little bit about how you would send a message to a message board. This is not just about reading other people's messages. There are going to be situations where you're going to want to send a message to a message board. How do you do that? Whoops. Okay. It's very easy. You're going to open the channel for the message board to which you want to send a message. It's very important when you're sending a message, they need to be in the right channel. if you're working on project number 5, you don't want to be sending a message on project number 5 to the project 3 channel. So make sure you're in the right channel. And as we saw earlier, you can do that by, you do that initially by clicking on the channel in the purple area. And then you'll see in the center section at the upper left-hand corner, to remind you what channel you're in, the name of the channel will appear there as well. So you can double check that. And then what you're going to do is you're going to scroll down to this section at the bottom. And you will see something called a message box. And if you look in the upper left-hand corner of the box, you should see the notation message. And again, the name of the channel that you're in. So this is yet another way to double check that you're in the right channel before you send your message. So then all you have to do is type your message into the message box, just like an email message. And notice that just like an email message, you can attach a file by clicking on this little paperclip icon down at the bottom. And then once you've finished your message, you're all ready to go. You can either press the enter key on your keyboard, or you can click the send icon. And that's kind of grayed out here because we haven't typed anything into the message box. And your message will be immediately sent and immediately posted on the, in this case, the general message board. And where is it going to appear? Because it's the most recent message, it's going to appear at the bottom because yours is the most recent message. And that's how the message boards organize their messages. Most recent messages at the bottom. When I was working on the North Carolina Voter Assistance Hotline, I only sent a few types of messages to the message board. But depending on the type of workspace they're in, there are other types of messages that you might send. For example, I would send messages during every shift, notifying hotline managers when I started and I ended my shift. It was sort of like clocking in and out, and all the volunteers did that. I also posted any question that I had received from a caller, and that, notwithstanding my very best efforts, I couldn't find an answer to, or perhaps I find an answer, but I wasn't sure it was 100% right. In both cases, I wanted to check in with the experts on the hotline to make sure I was given the right advice. I sent in reports of voting interference incidents, for example, harassment at polling places that hotline callers told us about. These incidents needed to be addressed immediately. So our hotline managers asked that we post them on the message board ASAP. Sometimes a volunteer would post a question on the message board that I actually knew the answer to. And if that was the case, I'd post a reply to the message, and we'll talk about how you reply to message board messages in a few minutes. And then the final type of message that I sent, and these were fairly rare, were messages containing information that I thought would be of interest to the hotline volunteers. So, for example, last September and October, the Washington Post was closely following some of the numerous lawsuits on North Carolina election requirements. And if I read an article in the Post about the status of particular litigation or about a court decision, I would send a link to my fellow hotline volunteers on the assumption that, like me, they were trying to keep on top of these developments, which directly affected our work on the hotline. I've noticed that in some Slack workspaces, team members use message boards for schmoozing and posting messages that are off topic. That wasn't a concern on the hotline message board. Everyone was very focused on their hotline work, but it can be an issue on some Slack message boards. So just be forewarned. Are there any questions about how you send a message in Slack?
Yeah, if you're attaching something, does it come through showing as just there being an attachment, or does it actually input a whole bunch of text that just expands your message?
I never sent an attachment, and I can't recall from my work on the hotline receiving or looking at a lot of messages that had attachments. So I'm not really sure. I'm sure that there's a way to access the file because people are going to be sending in files that can't easily display. They could be word processing files, they could be photo files, they could be PDF files, they could be all kinds of things. So I assume you will have some access to the file itself on the message board, but I'm not exactly sure whether any part of the file, particularly if it's a text file, is replicated. Michelle, did you have a question?
Question about if you wanted to, like you mentioned, maybe there was an article in the Washington Post that you wanted to post on in a message. How would you exactly do that?
I just put in a link. And then what would happen for links is that, because Slack is pretty sophisticated, it would display the link to the web page, and then it would display a little clip from the actual article, the actual post article. So you would see the beginning of the post article. You might even see a picture from the post article. And then if the person reading the message, if one of my teammates said, oh, I'd like to read this post article, then they could just click on the link and that would take them to the Washington Post webpage.
That's actually showing on your screenshot.
Yeah, that's an example. Yeah. Where someone has sent it. Can you see here? I don't know whether people can see here. There's a link.
Oh, yeah.
And people could click on that. But I'm not sure how, if you attach a document, exactly how that's displayed.
If you post something and it's messed up, like your link is garbled or something, and you decide you want to delete what you sent, can you do that?
I'm not sure you can delete it, but what you can do is send in a reply that corrects it. And what I'm going to talk about replies in a minute. The way you reply to messages in Slack puts the original message and the reply message together in kind of a bundle, so that people who see the original message would also be able to see the reply as well. Okay. Well, that's a nice segue into replying to messages. Oh, Hallie?
I'm pretty sure I posted one in the wrong place once, and the expert person said delete it and put it in the right place. So I did. I'm pretty sure.
Okay. So maybe there is a way to do that.
Made it clear what
That's great. That's great to know. And maybe you can only delete your own messages. You can't delete other people's messages, because having people have the ability to delete messages on the message board that weren't their own messages could be very problematical. Okay, replying to messages. As I mentioned a moment ago, one of the main reasons team members send messages to a Slack message board is to ask questions and hopefully get an answer from their teammates or one of the team leaders. If you'd like to reply to a teammate's question, maybe have a good answer, you have some information that's relevant, it's very important that you reply to the initial message by replying, quote, in thread, unquote. When you reply, quote, in thread, as opposed to just sending another message to the message board, your reply is grouped with the original message. And that makes it easy for team members to see all the replies that fellow team members have sent in response to a particular question. And you may be familiar with the concept of message threads from your email program. And here's an example from Gmail, which a lot of people use. You may have noticed in Gmail that you can ask Gmail to organize your inbox messages in descending date order, like this. Everybody see that? Or you can ask Gmail to automatically group related email messages together in threads, what Gmail calls conversations. And that's what your inbox would look like if you asked Gmail to group messages in threads. So how do Gmail and other email programs do this? What email programs do is they look at the subject line of your messages, and they assume that messages with the same subject line are related. They're a continuing conversation about the same topic, and they group them together. And that is often, in fact, the case. So for example, for this group of messages here, Mary, Bob, Anna, and I are talking about our February Zoom call. And there are 8 messages related to that. And similarly, for this particular message, Sue, Alice, Steve, and I are talking about book recommendations, and there are 11 messages for that. And they're all grouped together. They're not in date order. So why doesn't this automatic grouping system work in Slack? And the reason it doesn't work in Slack is because, as we discussed a few minutes ago, Slack messages don't have subject lines. So Slack doesn't have any way of automatically figuring out which messages are related. Is this message related to this message? How does Slack know? It doesn't know. So what that means is that the work of grouping related messages needs to be done manually. And manually means you, the team members who are sending messages and replying to messages in a Slack message board need to group related messages together. And so how do you do that? How do you reply to a message in thread when you're working in Slack? And the way you're going to do that is, let's say this is the message that you want to reply to. You're not going to send in a message using the general message box in the center section. What you're going to do instead is you're going to mouse over the message that you want to reply to. And this little icon menu is going to come up, and you're going to click on the icon, the reply to thread icon. And what that's going to do is it's going to open the right section of Slack, and you'll see the word thread here. And in the right section, you'll see the original message. You'll see any replies that have been filed by your teammates. And then here's the important thing. Down at the bottom is a little message box that you're going to use to reply to that message box. You're not going to use this message box in the center section. You're going to use this message box in the right section. And it works just like the message box in the center section. But what it's going to do is it's going to group your reply with the original message and then all other replies to that message. Another way you can access this, this right section, if people have already replied to the message, and you can tell that by looking at the message and then looking right below the message, and it will say 3 replies or 5 replies or whatever. You can click on replies, and that will open the right section. You'll see all the replies. And again, you can scroll down to the bottom. Whoops. And this is the message box that you're going to use to reply. And let me just show you how that works in a real Slack. Here's a good example. So here's the message. Let's say I want to reply to this message. I mouse over the message. This is one way to do it. And do you see this little? You see this little menu that comes, little icon menu that comes up? And then I click reply in thread. And here's the original message at the top. And then here's a little message box at the bottom, and it even says reply. So this is going to be a reply message. It's not going to be a new message. It would be the case if I use the message box in the center. And then I just type my message and I send it. And then the other way, as I mentioned, that you can access this right-hand section is if I wanted to reply to this message, you'll notice that there have already been 2 replies sent to this message. So all I have to do is click on those. And that also opens the right section. And again, there's a message box for sending another reply to the original message. It really is pretty easy. You just have to remember to do it. Does everyone understand the concept of replying in thread and how to do it in Slack? It's very important technique for making sure that messages and their replies are kept together so the team members can find them. Okay.
So how do you, if you just want to look at a thread on a subject?
Yeah, sometimes
how would you find that? So you're not actually replying to one of the messages, but you
Well,
want
I
to see
think
the
this is
thread.
the one that we just did is a good example.
Mhm.
Let's
Mhm.
say for this particular message, I'm not interested in replying, but I'd like to see what the replies are.
Mhm.
So I just click on 2 replies, and
Mhm.
can you see up here? Here's the original message,
Right.
and here are the 2 replies that have been posted by my teammates.
Right. Okay.
And on the voter assistance hotline, this was very important. So for example, one of your teammates on the voter assistance hotline would have some stump the stars question that they'd gotten from a caller. And
Mhm.
what you'd see is in the main message board, you'd see the stump the stars question, and then you'd see that there were 13 replies.
Right.
And so you'd say to yourself, boy, I'd certainly like to know the answer to that question because I could get that on my shift.
Yeah.
So you'd click on 2 replies, you would see the original question, and then you'd see all the replies that had been sent in by teammates.
Right.
And
So
so if that question came up on your shift from a caller, you would know what to tell them.
So just so if you don't have an email in your head, say I'm just going on and I know that what's the advice for today is the advice to vote early, or is it to proceed with curing the absentee ballot? But I don't have any emails. I don't, I'm just thinking I need an answer to this question. Do I have to then go to the center section and scroll through and find somebody who's asked that question in order?
No, what
to
you're going
find-
to do is you're going to use a search engine, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions about replying in thread? Replying in thread was so important that at least on my hotline shifts, almost every shift, the whoever the manager was for that particular shift would remind us to reply in thread, because a lot of people just failed to do it. They would instead use this message box to reply to messages instead of this one. And it makes it very difficult then for other team members to find all the replies to a particular question. So that was a very, very important aspect of working on the hotline. Again, this goes back to a point that I made earlier, that you need to work hard, because you're not just organizing your messages for yourself, you're organizing them for hundreds and hundreds of other team members. And if you don't do your job of putting your messages in the right channel, if you don't do your job of replying in thread, you're just going to make it hard for your teammates to find messages.
So Lisa, when I had Slack, it seems like I would get messages on my email a lot of times that would say, you have a response from Slack. And I'd be like, I'd go to Slack and I'd be like, I don't know what they're talking about. There wouldn't be any reply to my messages. Or do you know sort of what that's about?
I never got those. Julie, do you know?
Yeah.
Does it involve signing up for notifications?
Yes, this involves notifications, and the very last question on notifications is, do you want to receive emails? So that's something that I think we'll talk about at the end for those people who don't just want to sort of check into Slack periodically, but who want to get notifications, because you can be bombarded or you can choose not to be. So why don't we postpone that till the end of our discussion? And then I'll show you a notifications selection where you select your preferences.
Okay. I think this is obvious, but a little practical tip. If you're replying to a message and when you open this right-hand section, you see that somebody has already made the point that you were going to make, don't make it again. The point has already been made, and if you make it again, you're just adding to the amount of text that people have to read when they're looking at replies to that particular question. In addition to sending questions, comments, etc., to a message board, you can also send messages for particular team members within Slack. For example, when I was working on the North Carolina voter assistance hotline, each shift had a tech expert to help volunteers with connection, software, and other technology problems. And if you had a technology problem, you didn't send a message to the message board, you sent a message directly to the tech expert. So how do you do that in Slack? Oops. Messages that are sent to one or more individual team members are known as direct messages or DMs in Slack. And you can view your DMs, your direct messages, by clicking more in the left section, the purple bar, and then a little menu will open, and one of the options in the menu is all DMs. And when you click all DMs, all your direct messages will show up on the right. And let me just illustrate that in on the actual website. So if I want to see my direct messages, I just click more here, and then I click all DMs. And I'm obviously not very popular because I've only got two direct messages. One from Hari, who's the guy who's basically team leader for the workspace, and Julie was kind enough to send me a message as well. So those are all my direct messages. So if I want to send a direct message to somebody, I want to contact the tech expert because I'm having a connection problem or some other type of problem. It's very easy to do. Again, we're in the purple section, we're in the left-hand section. We click on this little compose new message icon, and that opens a composition screen on the right. And what you're going to do is you're going to start by typing in the display name of the person to whom you want to send a message. So if I want to send a message to Julie, I'm going to start typing Julie Greenberg because that's her display name in Slack. And you'll notice it comes up. And you've probably seen this in email programs. When you start typing the names of people who are in your contact list, the names come up in alphabetical order. And then I can just pick this. I can just select this, so I don't have to type the rest of it. And you'll notice that there's a blinking cursor after Julie's name. And that's because if you're sending a direct message, you can send a direct message to anywhere between 1 and 8 people. So I could add some more names after this. And then all I have to do to send a message to Julie is to go down to the bottom section down here, where again, there is a message box that looks exactly like the 2 message boxes that we've discussed. The message box is in the center section and the reply message box, and I type my message. I can, again, add a file. And then when I'm done, I just hit the enter button. I'm sorry, hit the enter key on my keyboard, or I click this little send icon, and that message will go directly to Julie. That will not be on the message board. People normally don't use direct messaging a lot, but it's helpful for some things. Questions about direct messages? And does everybody understand the difference between a direct message and a message that you would send to the entire group that would appear on the message board? So I think that's the important distinction. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, all Slack messages are archived in a word searchable database. Remember that the S in Slack stands for searchable, and this makes it easy to find messages that are old, but may have information that's very useful. And I'll give you an example from my voter assistance hotline experience as to why being able to search old messages can be important. During one of my shifts, I got a call from a voter in Charlotte, North Carolina, who wanted to know whether there were individuals or organizations that were arranging rides to Charlotte area early voting centers or polling places. And I didn't know the answer to this question, but I figured this was likely a very common hotline question, and that other hotline volunteers may have posted answers to this question. So rather than posting the question on the hotline message board, rather than going to the center section and to the message box in the center section and sending in a message, I did a search of past messages using the Slack search engine. And when I typed ride into the search field, I got lots of search results. And then by skimming those results, I was able to find 2 good leads for my caller. There was a phone number and a website where voters could arrange transportation to the polls in the Charlotte area. The Slack search engine works pretty much the same as search engines you've used in other software programs. The search engine is at the top of the center section, and you just click it, and then this little box opens, and there's an area where you can type your search query, and you can also refine your search by telling Slack that you're only interested in searching messages. And that's almost always what you're searching. But you can also refine it to search for files or channels or people. And then you just press the enter key on your keyboard and you get a whole bunch of search results. And then you're going to skim through those and see if there's something that's helpful for you. And let me just demo this in Slack. Let's say I'm interested in finding out whether VoPro Pros currently has any projects planned for Democratic primaries for the 2022 midterm elections. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Maybe it's too early, but maybe they have some messages on that. So I'm going to click the search field at the top, search VoPro Pros. This little box opens, and I'm going to type in the word primary. And then I'm going to click my enter key here. And you'll see that there are 11 messages that contain the word primary. And I can just kind of scroll through these and figure out if one of them has information that I'm interested in. Notice over here on the right, I can narrow my search. For example, if I'm only interested in messages that were sent to the general channel, I can click that. And you'll notice only 4 of these messages were sent to the general channel. And the other 7 were sent to other channels. But that can be important if you have a lot of channels and you really only want to see the messages that were sent in a particular channel. Though just one more thing I'd like to point out before we have questions. Like many search engines, if you want to run a sophisticated search, Slack has its own set of search operators. And in your slides, there's a slide on searching, and the link to the search operators is at the bottom of the page if you want to do more sophisticated searches in Slack. But being able to search past messages, at least for the voter assistance hotline, was extremely, extremely helpful, because I don't want to be asking a question that has already been asked and answered by other hotline members. And you can run a search, lickety split, the search results come back very, very quickly. Questions about searching?
So is it literal, for example, on the primary example, if you were looking for primaries 2022, and you think in a message, you might see primary in one part of it and 2022 in a different part of the message. If you search for primary 2022, are you only going to pull up messages that have those 2 words juxtaposed?
I can't remember but if you check this page on search operators, they'll tell you how to format your search so that you can get the search result that you want.
Okay.
Because as you know, sometimes it's and, sometimes it's or,
Right.
Search queries can be quite sophisticated. And Slack does have, as I said, a system allowing you to make these more sophisticated searches with its search operators. And the search operators in Slack aren't necessarily the same as the search operators that you might use in Google or other search engines. Okay.
Yeah, so if I can just interrupt for 1 minute, Lisa, I think we have some people who have to move off, but they've expressed their thanks in the chat. I think this has been very useful. So at this point, maybe if we can wrap up and then go to any remaining questions.
Okay, because the only things I have to cover are pins and learning more about Slack, and I think I can get through that in a few minutes.
Okay.
And I'm sorry I'm running over.
No, I think this has been fantastic and everybody's appreciated. We just, didn't estimate the time very well, but that's
Yeah.
okay.
Well, that's great that there's a high level of interest. I think that's
Yeah.
always good. In some Slack workspaces, and this was certainly true at North Carolina voter assistance hotline, there's an enormous amount of material sent to message boards. So how do you quickly figure out what's important and what isn't? And in a well-managed workspace, your team leader should be helping you with this task by pointing out information that all team members really, 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 really need to pay attention to. And the way this is done in Slack is that the team leader pins important information for other team members. Pinning consolidates important information in one place. And the way team members access pinned information is to click on this little push pin icon, which is in the upper left-hand corner of the center section. And that opens the right section to an area where all the pinned materials appear. And again, I'll show you this live in at the Slack website. So let's get rid of this search, these search results. So if, let's say in the general channel, I'm in the general channel and I'm interested in seeing what the pins are for the general channel. What does the person who's managing the workspace think are the most important things that I need to know? So I go to the center section, I go up to the upper left-hand corner, and I click on this little push pin, and hopefully you can all see over here on the right, there's a section called pinned. And these are the items that the team leader for the workspace thinks are the most important items that I, as a team member, need to pay attention to. When I was working on the North Carolina voter assistance hotline, the first thing I do after I opened Slack for one of my shifts was to check pinned items. And most days, there were at least a dozen pinned items that I needed to read. There would be new guidance from the North Carolina Board of Elections. There would be new court decisions that affected the advice we were giving to callers. There were new hotline procedures and other important issues. And if you have a good team leader, pins are critical to enabling you to stay on top of issues and do your work properly. Okay, well, that's a brief overview of Slack. And on this last page of your slides, here's some information about learning more. If you want to learn about Slack's other features like Slackbot and how to use them, Slack has a web page where you can access more information about using Slack, and it includes getting started guides and a list of frequently asked questions, tutorials, and including video tutorials. And if you click on this, it will take you to this page. And I haven't fully explored this page, but based on a quick skim, it looks pretty good. The instructions are easy to follow and they look to be up to date. Another good source of information about Slack are YouTube videos that have been created by third parties, not Slack. Slack, as we've indicated, is a very popular message board program. And so there are third parties that have created videos on how to use it. And the ones that are listed in the slide are pretty basic. They're not dealing with advanced features. So they're a pretty painless way to learn more about Slack. And you can just make some popcorn, sit back, click the play button, and you're all set to go. And you might be particularly interested in this YouTube video that's been prepared by VoPro Pros. In this video, the workspace manager for VoPro Pros explains how they plan to use Slack in their activities. I think it's about 20 minutes long, so it's worth watching. And then finally, at the end of your slides is a list of the other versions of Slack that are available. As I mentioned, we were looking at the web-based version of Slack, but there are desktop apps and there are also mobile apps if you would like to work with Slack on a mobile device. And Julie, I think we're done, so we can now take more general questions from folks in the audience.